Hello and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. Every year we have our editors in residence sit down for a conversation about one topic or the other that they find important to them in literature. So we are your editors in residence. I'm Justine Manzano. This is Hannah Cates. And we are going to be talking today about trauma in Kidlit. So Hannah, I think you wanted to start us off.
I did. And first off, Justine, congratulations on your recent release of Skeleton Key, the second book in the Order of the Key series. Mine is in the mail. If you guys haven't ordered it yet, you are missing out. So first off, we just have to get that out of the way because it's an amazing book. It's an amazing series. And it actually, it ties into exactly what we're talking about today. And that subject, I have to introduce with a little bit of an anecdote. So I work with all sorts of authors in all sorts of genres and all sorts of age groups, but my heart really is in middle grade. I love that age group. It is so important. It's such a beautiful time in everybody's lives. And I love working with middle grade authors and the stories that they choose to share. And I was working with an author and she was writing this, well, it's written now, an amazing book full of action, just so touching. It's about a little girl who plays a part in taking down a puppy mill. And the book is so excellent. I'm not going to give away too many spoilers, but basically this girl gets followed by a ghost dog, and it ends up this ghost dog is looking for her puppies, and the mother dog has passed away, but she's out begging for help for this little girl to save her babies. I may have cried 3 or 4 times, but this author who I was working with edits came to me just disgruntled, and she said, "Hannah, I had somebody read my book and he hated it. And he said it was awful. And he said it was inappropriate for children because, quote, children's books shouldn't be scary and they shouldn't be sad," end quote. And my heckles just immediately fled. And that's why I think that trauma in Kidlit is very important, is something that should be discussed, especially right now coming out of a global pandemic. And I'm going to open the floor with that because I vehemently disagree with that statement. And I've got a lot of reasons why. And I know you do too, Justine.
Oh, yeah. I feel like, well, I guess for starters, I mean, why would you say, we'll start with you. Why would you say that it's important to discuss trauma in children's literature?
Well, so Kate DiCamillo, she actually wrote an amazing article for Time magazine a couple of years ago. I'm looking at it here. I forget what year it came out, but she addressed this topic. She addressed why there is sadness in children's books. And if you can go read it, it's a fantastic article. She talks, she's actually writing to one of her readers who was talking about a difficult time in his life and how her book, Because of Winn-Dixie, touched him. And she talks about our responsibility as authors to make children feel seen. And I truly believe too that there's room for all sorts of books, right? We have our issue books that are purely about contemporary issues that we address and we hit head on. Some fantastic books that are some of my favorite. I love The Tulip Touch. That's a little bit of an older one, but dealing with a girl who is sociopathic, a young middle grade girl. From the Desk of Zoe Washington came out a few years ago, where a middle grade girl is dealing with her father who is incarcerated, and she's writing letters back and forth for him. And those are about, these real life issues that children are facing. But then we also have books that don't necessarily have to be issue focused. So let's talk about the Artemis Fowl series and Artemis dealing with his mentally ill mother. That was the first time in my life that I had ever read about a parent who was mentally ill. And living with a mentally ill parent myself, that was just, it blew my mind, and it touched me in a way that really surprised me and really served to put my life that I was living in context when nobody else would put it in context for me. Justine, your books are so great, particularly Order of the Key, because we're dealing with things like abusive parents, physical abuse, verbal abuse, broken families, seeing violence in the home. And Order of the Key isn't necessarily, it's not an issue book, it's a fantasy book, but just having that representation in there and making those readers feel seen and provide a framework for that experience is so important. Kate DiCamillo, she's won 2 Newbery Awards. She says, I think our job is to trust our readers. I think our job is to see and let ourselves be seen. And I think our job is to love the world. And that's how she includes the article. Everything else before it is just as great. I highly suggest you go read it. But when this commentator is saying that books, especially children's books, shouldn't be scary or sad, my argument is that books are a mirror and a window into who we are as humans. And the fact of the matter is, life is scary and sad. And children, who are some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, that existence can be scary in all sorts of ways. And we're not here to say, one trauma is worse than this. Is not the trauma Olympics, but being a child, you have no purchasing power. You are completely at the mercy of your parents. You don't understand the world yet. So I write middle grade, and particularly middle grade horror, because I think discussing that trauma and bringing it into the open and showing characters who are facing those challenges and coping and triumphing in the end is important.
Absolutely. I feel like, just like you said about being a child is inherently a little scary because you're at the mercy of every adult around you. And it's not even just like, that's fine if you have adults that are handling things well and are well adjusted and are, doing their best and really trying to spare you from trauma. And then you have other adults in your life who may not be, if you have, or some people, all of the adults in their lives are not okay. And dealing with that, like alone, without any frame of reference, it can be really, really rough. And I know that I have talked to people who really didn't even know that they were in situations that weren't normal. Like, to them, it was like, oh, well, everyone has parents like this, right? Or everyone has, like, this is the way life is. And then, then they meet friends later on in life and they go to their house to visit and they're like, oh, what do you mean? You don't have to, you don't get hit. Like
you don't hide in the closet. Wait, you don't do that?
Yeah. And it's weirdo. Like things like that are like, reading who you are in books. And it's not even just like, we're talking like, I'm mentioning abuse in the home, but when I was young and I suffered from, I still suffer from scoliosis, but, Deanie is by Judy Blume is about that. And that's the only book I'd ever read that had scoliosis in it, that touched that topic. And especially because I ended up needing surgery for it. Needing major surgery on your spine is no joke. And at
that age too.
I was 15. And on top of that, suffer from anxiety. So I was researching percentages of survival and was obsessed with the 1% that didn't, and decided, like, in my head, that was me. I was totally going to be that 1%, because why? Someone has to be, right? And that, because that's life with anxiety. But having a book out there that at least explored similar ideas was so healing for me. It wasn't the exact same situation in that book, but it was super helpful to read that anybody else besides my aunt and my mom and my sister had scoliosis. Like, I didn't know anybody who had it. And having that and being, having that, like you said, feeling seen, is so important, but it's also not the only thing that's important, because you also have the ability to see into other situations through books. And to me, that is really important too, because I won't ever know what it's like to have schizophrenia, thankfully, God willing. Or whatever.
We still got time.
I know, right? So I thought it, as soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, you know what? No.
We're not going to speak that into the universe.
Exactly. But knowing that, like, okay, or even more important, or more not important, more direct, I guess, and to the point that I was trying to make. I really will never know what it's like to be the main character of Angie Thomas's The Hate U Give. Never. That will never be something in my lived experience. And yet I can learn about it because I am reading a book. I will never be able to, like, that will not be my experience. But when people read books, main characters are inherently sympathetic. And while reading and getting into a main character's headspace, it helps to spread that sympathy to people like them.
To invite readers into experience they wouldn't normally.
Something that they never, yeah. And so once you've experienced that through a character's eyes, it changes the way you think. It makes, and I feel like it makes for a more healthy world.
Yeah, it provides an experience of empathy.
Exactly. So, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, after you. I was going to make another point.
No, I was just going to say, so, reading in these other worlds, reading these other people that you can't see through their eyes, that you will not be able to just understand by knowing them or by knowing of the situation. It's so important. And that doesn't get out there unless you're writing about these things that are frightening and are not, easy to write about. And for instance, now I'm trying to think of the name of the book, but Nick Stone just made an announcement earlier today. Dear Martin. And it's about police brutality. And she was saying that people were looking to ban her book, and that because it made students that read it feel bad. And her point was that, okay, I don't want to make anyone feel bad. However, I read books with the N-word in it growing up, and Nick Stone is Black. And she's like, I had to read those, and I couldn't say that I didn't want to read them because they made me feel bad.
Well, and at what point should police brutality make you feel bad?
I mean, you should always feel bad about that. I mean,
that's kind of, and that's, when we say books are sad and books are a little scary, like my roommate's daughter just now grasped the concept of mortality and was weeping furiously last night because she doesn't want to die. And she's 4, and it's just hit her that she doesn't want to die, and someday that everyone she loves is going to die. And that's I think about my dog, and someday that my dog is mortal and that he's going to pass on. And I wake up in the middle of the night sobbing. More these topics, police brutality, mortality, mental illness, they are scary and they are sad. And that article that I mentioned by DiCamillo, she talks about how the effect that Charlotte's Web had on her as a young child, and how E.B. White takes this very big, very scary concept of death and passing on and mortality in the character of Charlotte, where Wilbur is weeping over her and mourning her because she has to die to give birth and to give new life. And we cry every single time we read that book. And I've read that book multiple times. And every time I read the book, I know Charlotte is going to die. But that doesn't stop the joy and the beauty from the story. And that just that little book, that book that's geared for that age, 8 to 12, gives you that concept and that framework to grasp something that's so overwhelming and so scary. You can start to make sense of it. And with books like The Hate You Give and Star Story, that's something that, as a white woman, I can't comprehend. But what Angie Thomas does is give us this beautiful framework and invites us in. Hey, here's something that you won't experience. Can you step into this space of understanding?
Exactly. And that's, you can't ever shield children from eventually learning these realities. My son is 12 now, and I remember that time when I remember the day he realized that he was going to die one day. I remember, and it was hard to watch him deal with it, and he was like, how am I, and he has anxiety too, and you can kind of tell it right from hearing this. He's like, how am I ever not going to think about it? Like, how would it ever not be in the front of my mind? And I'm like, it's kind of like when that moment where you realize that your tongue is in your mouth. Have you ever had that feeling? You're like,
no, I'm not going to never not think about the fact that my tongue is in my mouth.
Well, yeah, I'm like, oh, right, I can feel my tongue there. Or like, I do it with my glasses sometimes where I'm like, oh, I see the edge of my glasses. I don't normally notice that. And then it drives me nuts for the rest of the day. Like, I keep seeing it there. But we mostly go through life with it not mattering. But then someone points it out and you're like, and I just ruined your day, I think.
Now I'm very aware of my glasses and my tongue. Thank you.
Sorry. You're gonna be like peeking out of the corner.
Yeah, now like, oh, it's on the edge. There are these things on my face that I just conveniently forget about that I magically corrects my vision. Oh my God.
Exactly. But I told him, I was like, just like that, these things will fade back into the background eventually, and you won't think about it as much in the forefront. But particularly for kids who are dealing with a crisis, they can, it's a way to help you cope.
And a framework to provide a way to cope. So that's why I love, actually, there was a point in my own life in my early 20s where I had always been scared of everything, like hated scary movies, hated horror, and went through some traumatic experiences of my own, and just all of a sudden had an insatiable appetite for horror, just gobbled it down. The more gruesome, the more grisly, the better. And I was talking to my therapist about it. I'm like, I must be really twisted. Must be really messed up that I love all these messed up things. And she looked at me and she kind of smirked and she said, well, when you finish one of those movies, when you finish one of those books, does it make you feel like you survived? And I was just blown over, thinking like, in my own mind and suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, these events are replaying again and again in my head, and I'm trying to make sense of it. So another survivor's story, another tale of somebody facing trauma. And in middle grade horror, it's important to me that my characters survive and that they make it to the other side and that they triumph. They don't have to be completely safe or shielded forever, but that they get through the main ordeal to show kids that, yes, it gets dark, and yes, you will cope and you will do what you need to do to cope. And that's not always pretty.
Exactly.
But even when you look back on that you can be proud of that survival, and you can be proud of the way that you coped, and you don't have to be ashamed. And I want to bring this up before I forget. The National Seed Project coined a phrase called mirrors and windows that I love, and it's used a lot in the teaching community. So when we talk about stories as mirrors and windows, and I'm talking about, being able to connect with survivors, or even put yourself in their shoes, or at least try to take up the invitation to into somebody else's experience. We're talking about mirrors and windows. So a mirror, a story mirror, is when you look at that character and you can see yourself reflected back. And then a sliding glass door is, like we were talking about with Angie Thomas, is an invitation to step into somebody else's experience and somebody else's world to build not only personal strength, but also empathy. So I love that you're mentioning these things, because it goes right into the concept of mirrors and windows. And as a writer, and especially a writer for children in the middle grade, in that age bracket, I'm thinking, hey, what are the reflections of my own experience here? And what experience am I inviting my young readers into? What are they going to walk away asking? And what are they going to walk away learning?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. Like, you can't limit that in children, because children want to learn about other people. They want to get out there. They want to find new experiences and grow. And so that's not going to happen if they're reading happy books all the time. And like I was saying, like, there are things they're not going to escape. Guess what? So there's the news, right? We have the news, and the news does not care what age you are. And when there's things like what we recently went through in New York, which was yesterday, there was a shooting in a train, and they're going to hear about that. When things like terrorist attack or war happens, they're going to hear about that. Like, they're on news cover. You can't hide that. Like, you, especially not, I don't know. I live in a city. So there's literally, like, you walk into the corner store and there's newspapers, and the newspapers are right there. He walks by the newspaper rack going, to school. He's going to see the covers of the newspapers talking about war, talking about this, attack, this thing. And there really is no avoiding it. And if you pretend that there is, then your kid won't, like, build that base of coping mechanisms that I feel like exposing a kid to these things at a certain pace and in the right time, but just completely, like, washing the world and acting like everything is great all the time is a lie. And
it's a disservice.
Yeah.
It really is a disservice.
You can't build that kind of strength.
Well, and I totally agree with you, Justine. You make such a good point about pacing and context, right? And that's why books are so wonderful. That's why I think every genre of book is important. Every age group is important. Like, if your kid wants to read The Babysitter's Club, let him go read The Babysitter's Club. If they're into Goosebumps, if they're into Stephen King, like, hey, there it is. Kids will gravitate toward what they want to read and what they're sharing. And books are stories in themselves are such an important part of how we make sense of our culture. Like, just looking at classic monsters, let me geek out for a minute. Like the classic vampires stemming from the White Plague and from disease, and Frankenstein stemming from the Victorian fear of technology. And all of these monsters have cultural and important historical roots and human fear. Zombies being our visceral fear of disease and diseased bodies. Like, what's so scary about a zombie? I mean, it's going to eat your brain, but it's gross. And why are we grossed out by diseased things? Because disease kills you, and disease it's rolled into your DNA to be scared of it. Let's understand, like, primordially, why we're scared of people who are different, why we're scared of new science, why we're scared of things that we don't understand. We've been telling through religion, through stories, through oral traditions, we've been passing on these frameworks of creation and life and death and the gods and the weather. You see the very scary eclipse happening in the sky, and you don't know what's going on. You don't know if it's the end of the world. So you write a story about the gods playing basketball or whatever it is that you want to call it, because you want to have a framework of understanding. And one question that I get a lot, especially being an editor and working with middle grade, is this too much? Or is this too gory? Or is this too much blood? Or is this blah, 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 blah? what I always tell my readers is nothing is off limits. It's not, I mean, I have read books in that age group about physical abuse, involving torture, involving sexual abuse, involving self-harm, involving depression, involving psychopathy. It's not about this topic being off limits or that topic being off limits. It's about context, right? And when you're writing for a certain age group, how are you framing it? And whose eyes are you putting it in? So we talk about, like banned books or subjects being banned. Especially when dealing with trauma and Kidlit and personal and experience and the human experience, I think we're asking all the wrong questions when we're asking what's allowed and what's not allowed. Let's talk about the context that it's being put in. Let's talk about what's being taught and how it's being presented.
Right. I mean, there are limits in context. You can make something have, okay, so a lot of times if we'll, have stories that have sexual assault in them. Now, assuming that this is not creepy in the way it's portrayed, meaning drawn out, detailed, or in some way almost a positive experience, like, oh, this person, like that soap opera from back in the day where I think it was General Hospital, where the lead was raped by the guy, and then they ended up getting together, and it was like one of the biggest couples in the series. Like, no, that's not dealing with it correctly. That's disturbing. Like, but having the same thing with if you have someone who is extremely like a Pepe Le Pew type character, you don't want them to get together in the end because of what that's teaching. Right?
Or glorifying it.
Or glorifying, exactly.
Glorifying the relationship, like it's not a harmful relationship, or there's not a power dynamic there. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're handling the situation, but you're handling it in a way that teaches a lesson and shows that certain things are wrong, if you're not acting like the parent who, beats their child is, the hero of the story, which can happen sometimes in stories. Like I have a very controversial opinion of Batman.
You mean the guy that dresses up as a bat and then goes around beating up mentally ill people? That guy?
There's that. Well, okay, so to be fair, the original story of Batman was supposed to be, and had been up until they decided they wanted to get super gritty at DC, had been that he was trying to redeem them. It's also the reason why he has that whole no killing rule, because he's supposed to be trying to, yes, capture them, stop them from doing all the terrible things they're doing, yes. But because they're mentally ill, his whole point is to put them in a place where they can be redeemed. He also, with like street criminals, like regular, oh, I robbed this person because I needed money, he would give them cards to Wayne Enterprises and try to get them jobs there. Like these were the, like, this was the original character as he was painted. And in, I think it's like late 90s, they decided they were going to go super grit with him. And he is no longer acts like he cares about the characters that work with him. He is very closed off. He is way too violent, is not really trying to redeem as much as he used to. And his child sidekicks, which, if you were going to take it as if you were going to take it as what it was always kind of problematic. However, there's a whole history on that, but I'm not even going to get into it. I could go forever and it has nothing to do with it.
We need to have a whole superhero panel.
We could. Next year. But like his child sidekicks, now I've read, and comic book fans will disagree with me, but I've read 3 out of 4 of them getting beaten up by Batman for disobeying something. And, Yeah, you see your face because you're not familiar with it, but people will be like, well, he wasn't following the rules of what you're supposed to do as a vigilante. Like, and I'm like, no, but that you're glorified, your superhero is beating his child. He's adopted all of them.
Yeah.
So they're kids. So
yeah. What's the context here?
Exactly. So like the context is off. If the, you know, one character did turn bad for a while and was killing people by way of trying to rid the streets of bad guys. But because we are talking a lot of times about mentally ill people, you know, there are issues with that, and Batman confronts him, and yeah, okay, subdue him, get him arrested. That makes sense. Beating him to the point of needing like a special alien ship to heal him, maybe not so much. And this is our superhero, right? Like this is the character
we're glorifying. Yeah,
exactly. And there's where context can go wrong, where you can have stories where really terrible things happen. But if your context is correct, if you're showing how it affects the people involved and how it negatively affects the people who are hurt, and like really painting that picture of what it means, then, you know, like that, then you're doing the right job. You know, if you're not doing that, if you have this super extreme, like questionable reaction to what's going on, if it's positivity being heaped on something that is highly negative, then you might have a problem. Maybe this should not be in this book. Maybe you should pitch this for adult readers. Even then, I'd be questionable as far as like, I'd find it questionable about whether or not this should just be in a book. But people are going to write what they were going to write.
They're going to write what they're going to write. And like you said, what's the context? Like Batman in this case being the father figure. So my counter to that is going to be The Boys. And the Amazon series, The Boys, which is about superheroes with unchecked power who are just going out of control. Yep. And the Batman and superhero figures are awful. They're the villains and they're branded as these wonderful guys, but you see what they're doing and they're the bad guys.
And they're supposed to be the bad guys in the story. It is clear
the context
are the bad guys.
Is everything. So Jack Torrance, a classic horror novel, The Shining. Hurts Wendy, hurts his son, is an alcoholic, is abused himself, and ends up, things get very bad for him. If you've ever, sorry for the spoiler alert, the bad guy doesn't win. But that whole book,
far enough along that it's
I've seen the frozen Jack Nicholson meme, so I think, you know, but this whole book being about, and that is the horror of the book, is Jack's transformation, because at the beginning of the book, Jack is a good father and he is a good husband who is trying to be better. And the horror of the book is his past trauma possessing him and taking control of him vis-a-vis the hotel and causing him, wait for it, to become exactly like his own father, who he hates. The horror of that book isn't the ghosts. It's not the elevator full of blood. It's generational trauma. Exactly. The Shining, horror in general, is such a beautiful framework to understand these things, because we say like, oh, there's the monster under the bed, but what is the monster under the bed? What is it really? The Babadook. What is it really? Frankenstein. What is it really? Vampires. What are they really? Consumption.
Yeah.
So in understanding what we're afraid of, this is why I'm such a huge fan. I could just geek out about horror, and I know I've already done a panel on horror, so I'm not going to go on too long. But I can geek out about horror, because horror teaches us what we're actually afraid of. Horror is literary therapy, and I love it.
It's like, okay, so I don't like to be all pro Buffy the Vampire Slayer these days because of Joss Whedon and all of his.
But it's such a good series, though.
I know.
I wish that everybody would stop destroying all the things I love.
Exactly. But one thing he did right is that the whole thing was a metaphor for, as he put it, high school is hell. And it was, I mean, just so right on the money. I mean, the episode where Buffy sleeps with Angel for the first time, and then she wakes up and he's a monster after that. And the like that fear that you have that you're going to end up choosing someone and they're going to immediately drop you and find something better or something more important to them. The way he treats her is so exactly like that. Oh, well, I got what I wanted from you and now I'm done. It's not really what's going on story-wise, but that moment that she's coping with is so real, is so understandable and empathetic, and it's just
but I mean the brilliance in that and the brilliance in the storytelling, and we can all agree that Joss Whedon is a horrible person. But the brilliance in the story is two things can be true at once. The story is still brilliant. That Buffy isn't, there are real life issues, but the paranormal aspect, it really is a paranormal and horror thriller, but those horrific and paranormal elements are bigger. So I talk about, and I mentioned this earlier, that, you know, I read a lot of authors who are like, oh, I want to tackle these big subjects, and I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about that, and I want to change the views on this, and I want to change the views on that. The hate you give, the tulip touch, some kids will gravitate towards contemporary issue books, and those are important. And there are other readers that are going to gravitate toward high fantasy or urban fantasy or magical realism, and those books are important too. And we're not here to judge that one book is more important than the other, because that's just no way to look at things, right? Let's just see the significance in all of these stories and story in general as a vessel for communicating these broader issues and giving us the framework with which we cope and learn to cope with life. Because, oh, well, children don't need scary or sad books. Life is scary. Life is sad. And there's no way, like you said, there is no way you can shield your children from that. So even if, I don't care if you're reading the Sugarland Stable series and your favorite horse, Penny, falls and breaks her leg before the big show, like that might seem really trite and silly to us, but the fact is, like,
it's not.
Let's deal with disappointment. Let's deal with injury. Let's deal with, I think we run the risk too of saying like, oh, well, okay, if we need issue books, then all of them need to be about these big issues about war and political justice. Those are important topics. And there are other important topics like learning to control your temper, or learning how to lose, or learning, what happens, facing bullying, fitting in at school, getting a pair of braces. Let's look at Carrie becoming a woman and getting your period. Like instead of weighing which issues are important, let's look at the value of all of them and all of these stories that address these issues.
I'm trying to remember the book, but I remember I bought a book for Logan. He broke his arm when he was two about to turn 3. He's walking up a staircase and he like slid on the stair, and I was right behind him, caught him, but his arm caught in the banister and it broke.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, thankfully I was right behind him, and it wasn't like he didn't hit his head. He didn't, anything like that, but he broke his arm. Which was a fun time because he was crying, and I was like, I was like, did you hit your head? Because I thought he hit his head.
God.
He was like, oh, kiss the boo-boo. And I was like, okay. And I kissed his head, and he goes, no, not that one, this one. And his arms just sort of like, wah.
Oh,
yeah.
Geez.
So, yeah, that was a heart attack, but, get him to the hospital. He gets his cast, but it's annoying and he doesn't want it. And he's upset about it. And it was like July. It was like the very beginning of summer, and he can't get it wet. So he can't go in the pool. He can't go.
And it's sweltering and sweaty.
Exactly. So I went and I looked for a book about a kid who broke their arm. And he read it and he felt better about it. He did. Like, it was like a little, I wish I remember the name, but think it was Charlie broke. I think it was Charlie. The character was Charlie, and it was Charlie broke his arm or something like that. But it calmed him down about the whole thing so much. Like he was okay.
when you feel seen, when somebody comes to you and says, hey, I see you, I see your experience, I see your pain, I'm not here to judge it, I'm not here to put it on a metric of the most painful to the least, I see your pain and I relate to it, and you are seen, and your pain is worthy. Your pain is worthy. And that's with any pain, with any struggle, with overcoming any obstacle. I think that's a huge responsibility as authors that we need to be aware of, is readers being seen and readers also being shown that they're worthy.
Absolutely. It's funny because I have a theme this WriteHive. I've been on a panel about mental illness representation, and I've been on a panel about body representation. And it's all the same vibe. It's all people handle things better when they are seen, and people accept people more when they see representations of them in the stories that they read. But like you said, it's not absolutely not this is worse Olympics here. We know trauma can be, something can be traumatic for one person and it could be like the silliest little problem for another. Because
a baby who screams, it's probably screaming because it's 3 weeks old and that's the worst thing it's ever experienced. Ever.
Exactly.
Because it's a baby, because it's been on earth for not a lot of time. So if it falls or like hits its head, yeah, that's probably the most pain it has ever experienced. And
especially because they don't really form that much as far as like short-term memory and stuff, like long-term memory. So it's like, yeah, even if it happened before, it happening again is still the worst thing that they've ever been through.
Well, and that's why I think too, our jobs as authors isn't to judge what is worthy and what isn't worthy. One person's sliding glass door might be another person's mirror, and vice versa. It could be both a sliding glass door and a mirror. We're not here to judge that. We're not here to judge worthiness. And that's why I think it's so important too, as authors, to write authentically and to not be afraid, it's too much, is this fun? Again, it's not about what you write, it's about context and that authenticity, inviting that reader into that experience and then showing them, hey, I see you and I get it. Whenever I start a middle grade horror, the first question I ask myself is, what was I afraid of when I was a child? What was I afraid of? This book that I'm actually sending up in a week or so, when I was young, I'm so excited. When I was young, I had this hamster, and my brother also got a hamster, and the lady at Petco said that they were both females. They were not both females. So what happened was we had hamster babies, and I was so excited in the morning, getting up for school. I'm in kindergarten, go to school, we got hamster babies. I come home and the hamster babies are gone. And my dad remembers the story of coming home and seeing like a little leg being out of the side of mommy hamster's mouth, because this is a mammalian trait. A lot of animals in the wild, if they cannot take care of their young, they eat them. And my book is it is a horrific retelling of Hansel and Gretel. And their original, we had to soften it a little bit because it was a little much. And Scholastic said no cannibalism, which is still my favorite rejection. But looking at the fear of cannibalism, what our fear of cannibalism and the taboo and the fear of being eaten, the fear of Hansel and Gretel getting turned out and having the breadcrumbs in the forest and meeting this evil witch who wants to eat them, is the fear of scarcity. The fear that there's not enough, and the fear that the people who are supposed to be taking care of you are not going to. That's the primordial fear. And when you think about how vulnerable children are when they can't provide for themselves, when they have no purchasing power, and we say like, oh, that's really ridiculous, that's far-fetched. I have taught students who don't know where their next meal is coming from.
Absolutely.
I have taught students who go home and their refrigerator is not full. So we ask ourselves, is it that far flung? Is it that blown up or out of proportion?
Yeah, it's not. Sorry. I sun right in my eyes. Okay. So yeah, you definitely, it's not far flung to feel that. There are kids in the schools in New York who they had to continue providing, and I'm sure everywhere, a lot of other places, when the schools were closed for COVID, they had to continue providing meals. You had to come, you could come every day and pick up breakfast and lunch, because it would have been a serious problem for a lot of the children had they not gotten breakfast and lunch from the school every day. They would not be eating.
Yeah. And there are middle grade issue books, like wonderful contemporary issues about like being on school meal programs and being bullied about it, or, you know, having to eat the school lunch when everybody else brings their own lunch from home, and being in different socioeconomic statuses. And those are important. And then these horror books, right, about not being taken care of and put in a fantastical, scary, creepy. I know it's my own book, but I also argue that putting it in another framework is also important.
Yeah, because you don't have to tell it straightforward that way. You can find other ways to explain it and still make people feel seen, and still have that level of empathy, because the person who is going through it is going to recognize it, even when it's a metaphor. They're gonna,
even if your reader doesn't understand it at the time. There's that scene in the first Artemis Fowl where he goes up and his mother mistakes him for his father. And Evangeline Fowl is very sick, and she's kind of lost her mind. And there's a scene where like Artemis, you like in the book, he really gets upset about it. And it's very staggering for him, he's this child genius and he's running this huge kidnapping heist. He's not a good person. He's a kidnapper, and he's in the middle of the ransom negotiations, and you see this place where he becomes, after all of this power and manipulation and evil plan, he becomes a 12-year-old kid again. And the disappointment that his mother, the person who is supposed to be taking care of him, is not. And there's, you know, that kind of that buck chin up, there's a troll in my basement, I gotta go take care of it. But this scene where this 12-year-old has to not only swallow the sadness and disappointment and just this massive weight that he feels for his provider not being there for him, but then also has to go shoulder the responsibility for the rest of the household. And hey, you know, my parent is not available, so it's up to me to go make things right. My parent is not mentally available. My parent is not physically available. Let's think about, you know, all of us latchkey kids who had both parents who worked. And I mean, I took care of my 3 siblings from a very young age. Hey, parents aren't here. Guess what? Maybe I want to be a kid right now, but I can't, because I got to get dinner ready. And I got to be, you know, getting the younger ones to school, and I got to be taking care of it. Something as small as that, like wanting that comfort from the person who you look to for comfort, and then having in turn to shoulder that responsibility. Nobody would look at the Artemis Fowl series and be like, oh, well, there's these deep themes of like child neglect and growing up and this, but they're there. And it took me years later to realize why that scene stood out so much in my head, because I grew up with a mentally ill parent and I didn't understand it. And there was a lot of responsibility to shoulder in my household. And finally, there was one day it clicked. And that was really special for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that moment when you realize that you, like, maybe even like, why do I love this character so much? I mean, we always joke about, like, in fandom, there's all this joke about, that's my comfort character.
Yes.
And my comfort character is always like the most like ill-treated, beat up mess of a person. But that's my comfort character. And why is that your comfort character? Do you identify with them? Maybe are you like, I mean, this idea of maybe like always needing to be strong. I always pick, my comfort characters are always the badasses, the ones who have to, who have to take charge when things are going off the rails. Well, why does that appeal to me? Who takes the leadership when no one else is doing anything, doing what they need to do? Like, that's me. That's who I am as a person. We find in it.
And what I love about your book so much, Justine, and especially Order of the Key, is that there are hard choices. You torture your characters, and they're put in horrific situations where there is no good choice. And when they do the right thing, there are serious consequences. It's not, oh, I do what it's right. It's super easy and everything is great. Like, there are horrific choices that lead, it's out of the frying pan and into the fire, and there's consequences. And it reflects this idea that even when you do the right thing, or even when you stand up, or even when you get out of a horrible situation, that doesn't make everything right. And that things are complicated, that it's not just as easy as Kit breaking up with his mother, right? Like, things are complicated and they're nuanced. And what one person may be experiencing, you could look at it and be like, oh, well, easy solution is they should just sleep. They should just leave. They should just get out. Like, that woman should just get out of her abusive home and out of that abusive marriage. Well, it's not that simple.
Never that easy. It's never that easy.
Not that simple.
There's all kinds of dynamics when it comes to stuff like that, getting out of abusive situations. That, for one, I mean, the biggest one being that your abuser usually doesn't want you to leave. And if you go, that's going to be a consequence, and they're not going to leave you alone. They will find you.
And the consequence doesn't just affect you either.
Exactly.
It's through, the in the Order of the Key it's a fiction series, but the illustration and the framework of these bigger issues that we could just, I could go through this whole panel and just pick apart the characters and the nuance that's presented in loss and family dynamics. And I can't talk about it because I'm going to go way too many spoilers, but it goes so much farther beyond the story. So as far as saying like, oh, well, this book is more worthy than that book, or banning this book, or kids should have this, or kids shouldn't have that, we're asking the wrong questions. We're making the wrong statements when we discount the merit of story itself and story's power to take something, a theme, and make it more, and in fact, break it down into something that might be more digestible. And that might have, like my experience reading as a young child, like 10 years later, just hits you upside the head. And you're like, oh, well, holy guacamole. That book really helped me. That book comforted me in a way back then that I didn't understand, but I do now. And I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. Logan read The Hunger Games. Sorry, my son. For those who are not like consistently talking to me. My son read The Hunger Games, and he also he's just got a very political brain. And so he was tuned into that, but like there was a moment where he also read it. He said, I think the worst part of that story was when Katniss found out that the people around her that in the capital would throw up their food to make space for more food to eat. And he was like, that was like the worst part to me. And I'm like, oh, not all the people dying. And he was like, she was starving, and these people had so much that they could throw up and just fill up more and not feel bad about it. And it was just like, and that's the other thing, like you teach empathy, you teach him seeing that upset him, and that felt more real to him than the parts with the war and killing other kids, because thankfully he hasn't been exposed to that. But the idea of someone being so hungry and then seeing that other people have so much, that felt like human to him.
And that's really powerful. Wow. Providing that framework
Yeah, that's exactly what you're like, that's powerful. I'm like, that's what you've been saying this whole time.
And you can, and I think too, it's amazing to see, as like in my editing brain, um, you can open these doors for your readers, right? You can open them, and I encourage readers to writers to open those doors, right? You can hang up the mirrors, you can open the doors. You can't force anybody through them. You can't force anybody to look at the mirrors and see what you want them to see. You there's and the first example I gave, that comment from the man, and that my writer was so upset about. I want to also caution everybody that not everybody will agree with your vision. Not everybody's going to see the same thing. Not everybody is going to appreciate it. Not everybody's going to interpret it that way. And that's fine, because it is literally impossible. We have amazing books. We have classics. We have contemporaries that are being banned everywhere because people have their opinions on them, and won't look in the mirror or won't step through that sliding glass door because they are afraid of what they'll see, or they're afraid of that experience. And that, as a reader, as an editor, I get a lot of authors who, and I'm like this too. You're always afraid. And Justine, you've got to know this with releasing a book. Like, how are they going to react? How are people going to react? What if somebody thinks this thing, or what if somebody interprets that thing wrong? It's going to happen, and people are going to interpret it the way that they interpret. When you are doing your due diligence, you are doing your best, and you are being authentic about that experience, hanging up that mirror and creating an invitation to step through that glass door, that sliding glass door. That's where the buck ends. It really does. You cannot force anybody to look, and you cannot force anybody to step through. And some people won't, and some people don't have the courage to do that. Some people don't have the actualization, and that is what it is.
I mean, that's true. And in all things, you have people who just will not accept anything but their own experience. And they make decisions and believe those decisions so wholeheartedly that they will not bend their brains to try to allow anything else in. I'm not going to say we see that a lot in politics, but but
when can I vote for your son? When is that open?
When in the future, when he runs, he wants to be president, so he thinks that he can feed everybody easily and make sure that everyone has homes. He's 12, he's 12. These things didn't come from nowhere. Yeah. He's always been somebody who reads widely. He's always been somebody who interacts with his world in a different way than other people. And I feel like his mind is very open to the experiences of others. And so if we feed our kids this kind of information, the kind of information that helps them to understand others and empathize with them, then we're creating good kids, good people who are going to grow up to be the kind of people who empathize with others and help others and are willing to do that. And that is, I feel like, what as parents, and then also as writers, we have, am I saying that we have a responsibility to teach children everything that they know that makes them good? No, that's crazy. You can never do that. That's just over the top. But if you have a message to give, opening yourself up, because it's also, when you're writing trauma from a place of having that trauma, it is not easy to express that through your characters, and to make in a real enough way to make others empathize, because there has to be a level of distance from it without distance from the character, right? So
yes.
So I wrote a short story about what I was telling you earlier about scoliosis. Mm-hmm. And it was the first time I wrote it, I was too close to the story. and I gave it, it was very clinical. It was this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And these were all of the surgical things that they were going to do, and blah, blah, blah. Because at the time, that was as close as I could get to it as a writer. It was difficult to be close to the subject matter for me.
That's an excellent way to put it.
It's so to dive into the place I was at, especially 10 years later, to go back and be that 15-year-old girl who thought maybe she'd be paralyzed or die after getting this surgery. It was incredibly difficult. And then I stopped and I went back, and someone told me, they were like, you're very mechanical in the way you're telling this. And I realized that I wasn't tapping in really. So I put it aside for a while because I wasn't ready, and I knew it. And then I came back to it and I rewrote it, and it was a totally different story when I came to it. But this time I opened up and poured everything into it. And well, that was the one that got published. It wasn't the mechanical one that got anywhere. It was a different thing when I opened up. And that's not an easy thing. Like, writing a trauma, as someone who's experienced that trauma, means digging into old wounds. And
I would say too that the process is okay, and that you needing that time and needing to rewrite it and needing to, because there are authors I see and I've done this too, just bleed all over the paper, and that's fine too. Sometimes that needs to happen, and sometimes that's not the final draft either.
Yeah. And you know what the
that's
point
okay.
is, it's not going to be easy, and that's okay, right? You're either going to be able to tap into it now, or you're going to need time. But when you get it out there, that process is not an easy process.
And I've had cases where I've had to dial back. This was too close. This was
memoir. You were
thinly veiled memoir.
Yeah.
And I work with memoirs, and I work with a lot of nonfiction, narrative nonfiction writers. And it's very hard to strike the balance of authenticity and connection, and not just puke it all over the paper. And there are times that puking all over the paper can be therapeutic, and it's what needs to be done, whether that's the final draft or not, or whether the clinical draft is the final draft.
And that's the thing. What I was trying to open up there is that is also a good reason to write this. That if you want to tell that story and you want to make it so that other people understand, and you're maybe just healing you by writing it. Not only do you know, if you're healing you by writing it, that you're probably healing other people who are reading it. But you should, your writing is for you first. And
that's an excellent point.
It might get published. Things might happen with it. That would be awesome. Great. I mean,
I love that $6 million advance. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, that would be awesome too. Let's have that happen. But also that might never happen, and your book may never see the light of day, and that sucks, but it's the reality of it. But, writing it while also helping you learn to write, or because we're always learning. Aside from that, it can heal the wounds that you're trying to tap into to discuss this. And so it's not wasted.
No, that's absolutely not. No, that's beautifully put. It's not. And there's a reason too, with cognitive processing therapy, a lot of it is writing and a lot of it is speaking it out. And it is therapeutic, and it is worthy. And where I would encourage anybody who's listening to, wherever you are in the process, that's okay. That's okay. And to give yourself that space and to let it flow. That sounds like something from a Disney movie, and that sounds way too trite and woo-woo. But really just giving yourself the space to see what happens, especially when it involves personal trauma. And of course, context change. I honestly, like, you couldn't pay me enough. You couldn't pay me to go back to junior high right now. You couldn't. You couldn't. Because like
Same.
let me talk about how old I am. Like, I didn't have Instagram. I didn't have filters. I didn't have Snapchat. I didn't have anything about like with what modern teens and preteens deal with. It's a completely different ballgame. So there's, there are changes and things evolve and issues evolve, but let's go back to the basics. Let's talk about how we view our bodies, or how we view our parents, or what it's like being a preteen where you have cognitive rationalization and yet you are still under your parents' thumb, and how that starts to stir up strife. These things that, they may change contextually,
but they're universal.
But they really change. Yes.
Yeah, they're universal. And that's like, even the things like Instagram and Snapchat and Discord and all of these things, all these ways that people can talk now that put a lot of things on display that weren't on display before. Those things were still happening. So bullying someone for their appearance on social media, well, that would just happen in person anyway. And, telling everyone's business on, to the entire school, well, gossip. All of these things, they happen. They were always happening. They just found faster ways to happen and different ways to happen. But, you can write your story with social media or without, but that bullying part, that, that struggle to look perfect for everybody, for appearances, those things, they're still there.
Well, and like you said too, the context may be different, but you don't know your own experience. And I've heard this from some of my authors too. Who would want to read what I have to say? And my answer to that is, if you are going through this, you don't know who else needs it. Like, I'm sorry, honey, but there's nothing new under the sun. If you are going through this, there is going to be somebody who can relate in some way. I'm helping an author right now, editing for her, who she lost a parent during COVID. Her mother died of COVID, and I just don't think anybody will want to read my story. I don't think anybody will relate to it. And I asked her point blank, I'm like, you don't think that anybody else lost a parent to COVID?
So many people.
Like your experience, I'm sorry, your experience is your experience, but it's not singular. And you have no idea how many lives you are going to touch and who is going to relate to your story in what ways. So yeah, Justine, you made such a good point about the importance of every story and your personal experience, and writing that personal experience matters. It matters, even if you don't think that it is touching anybody, or like you said, you write first and foremost for yourself. But putting it out there and saying, oh, well, I'm not important because nobody else is going to be helped, or nobody can relate to this, or I'm too old, or my experience doesn't matter because it happened so long ago. You have no idea how your readers are going to relate and at what level they're going to relate.
Yeah. And
human experience, authentic experience matters.
Just taking it as you were bringing up order, and I put things in there and I didn't expect everyone to walk away with them, and they didn't, but hearing you talk about it and getting all the things that I was putting out there, it's for one thing, it's like awesome. Like it's like,
it's an awesome book.
I did a thing. But also it's like, it worked and it translated, and you picked up what I was putting down, and other people are going to do that for you. Like, other people are going to do that for all the writers that are putting their work out and putting themselves out on a limb, and they're going to pick that up, and it's going to help. It's going to change things. And the same thing for all of the readers. It's going to help them. It's going to change them. And I think this might be where we wrap it up.
Yeah, that's a beautiful ending. I don't have anything better to say than what you just said. Sure. You just capped it off.
Okay, well, you started, so I guess I had to close this.
This is perfect.
So I guess I want to say to everybody that if you enjoyed the discussion of, with me and Hannah, we also are on the Word Nerd Cafe with SK as our other host. We talk about, right now we're doing a series on mental health and writing. So if you want, you can join our Patreon. We do have free episodes up, but if you sign up for the Patreon, you get the whole 4 episodes a month. And we talk about things like this. And we work through the issues in writing. And so if you want to join us for that, that would be awesome. In addition, you can find myself, Justine Manzano, and Hannah Cates in the WriteHive Discord server, hanging around pretty much all the time. You can always just
usually more than I should be, honestly, but
yeah. And if you want to, if you're here watching this live, there is a live Q&A on this topic after the video airs, and you can meet us there in the Discord server, and we'll be hanging around to talk about it. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming to WriteHive 2022.
And Order of the Key.
Oh.
Justine won't promote, but I'm going. It's fantastic.
You should.